Now, the war alarm was an inexpensive alarm clock produced in 1943 and 1944 in response to a shortage of alarm clocks due to an expanding workforce and the conversion of clock factories to war work. In this presentation, we will look at the process leading up to the production of the war alarms and identify the companies who made them. I will attempt to establish a timeline and will pose some unanswered questions. But quite simply, a war alarm is a clock that bears the name war alarm on the dial. It has no name of a company that produced it, although it does have the city where it was produced. And by looking at this city, we can deduce where these clocks were produced. Oops. Okay. Why was there a shortage? Alarm clocks were in short supply because the production had ended as of July 31st, 1942, just as the workforce was expanding to meet the challenge of much greater war production. And here we have a little cartoon or drawing from a newspaper or magazine of the period showing one aspect of the shortage, and that is thieves stealing alarm clocks. Came across many such stories as I researched this. One that sticks out was a retailer that received an allotment of alarm clocks. He advertised that he would sell them Monday morning, and he said people lined up at 4 o'clock in the morning to buy these alarm clocks. And then when the store opened, that he sold 500 clocks within the first hour, and that was his allotment for, as far as he knew, for the future. But truly, there was a shortage of alarm clocks. Most U.S. clock companies ceased production of alarm clocks, as I say, on July 31, 1942, by order of the War Production Board, the WPB. Only Gilbert Clock Company was allowed to continue producing clocks, and we'll talk about why that was here in just a little bit. We'll also talk a little bit more about the WPB and another government agency, the OPA, and identify those actors in this script here. Now here's an article from August 1942 of a TikTok magazine, which was an in-house employee magazine for West Clocks. And this shows the last one coming down the line, the last West Clocks produced in 1942 there. And we see this line of very determined-looking ladies knowing that tomorrow, not that they're out of a job, but they've got even more important job to do, and they're going to go to work and make these many millions of parts that you see here that West Clocks made. As they show us some pictures, much later as the war winds down, they're free to talk a little bit more about what they've been doing, what the kind of parts they've made, and so forth. The upper picture shows some ammunition clips, little steel parts they made, and in the lower photograph, these are fuses, mechanical fuses. They contain a little clockwork mechanism with each one. And this is just part of a spread of a full 2-page spread of these things spread out there, and makes quite an interesting visual. And I hope to someday pursue a little bit more of what these factories were actually doing during the war and who was making what, and so forth. But on with our story. The government agencies involved in the production of war alarms were the WPB, the War Production Board, and the OPA, the Office of Price Administration. The War Production Board was established in January of 1942 to direct the conversion of industry to wartime production. They assigned production priorities and allocated materials. They controlled wages and the price of commodities. So the WPB was more or less concerned with production, as its name says. They were concerned with the industrial side of the economy, the production. The OPA, the Office of Price Administration, was more concerned with the consumers, workers, and so forth. They were established in 1941 grew out of an earlier agency, a Depression-era agency and so forth. They were abolished in 1947, and these dates play into our timeline as we look at when these clocks were produced. The OPA set the price of goods, set the retail prices, and they rationed goods. And over on the left, you will see a little price tag, the $4.95 OPA maximum price, and this is embossed at the back of one of the clocks. We'll take a look at those a little bit more in just a bit. I thought it would be fun to look at some articles and especially some magazine ads concerning the shortage of alarm clocks. Here on the left is an article from TikTok magazine again describing the results of a WPB survey highlighting the shortage of alarm clocks. And on the right, an ad from Telecron, actually in 1945, still indicating that there is a vital need for alarm clocks. Another Telecron ad from 1944. This puts the estimated number of alarm clocks needed at about 12 million. And we see, according to this ad, that, you know, at this point there are some electric alarm clocks being produced. And again, this plays into our timeline as we try to figure out when these clocks were actually produced. But we see the little blow up here says, you know, alarm clocks are vitally needed. Now, like the last little sentence there, if you have an alarm clock that can possibly be repaired, please leave the new clocks for the war workers who have none. Now we have one of a series of ads from West Clocks informing the readers of the need to take care of alarm clocks, talk about the shortage of alarm clocks, and so forth. Here we see a blow-up of Mrs. McGillicuddy. That's right. It says, that's right, Mrs. McGillicuddy. If anybody tries to molest your Big Ben, give them both barrels. And she looks like she certainly could and probably would, so I'm not messing with her. And down here we see another from this series, Guard Your Big Ben. No, we don't expect you to take the constable seriously, but we do hope that you'll seriously guard your Big Ben. So we have then another ad from West Clocks here, again indicating the need to take care of the clock you have. And I'd just like to say here that all the material here, these ads, the cuts from the TikTok magazine and so forth are all from the NAWCC Library and Research Center. I have the great fortune of being here and being able to access the library on a regular basis. But this collection of ads is just one of a small bit of watch and clock advertising that we have in the library. And of course, if you're familiar with the large formats like Life, Saturday Evening Post, so forth of that era, you know how exciting these ads are. They're big, they're colorful, just a lot of fun to look at. And these magazines and periodicals that we have, both from the companies and trade journals and so forth, are just invaluable research tools. And I do hope that you will take advantage of the library, both through loans and actually, as we have many people who come here several times a year just to do research. So thank you so much to the library. Now we'll move on here and take a look at the run-up to production. We find that the government agencies, the OPA and the WPB, began to act in January 1943 to meet the need for alarm clocks. And here's a list of some of the things they did. And again, I'm beginning to try to establish the timeline that we're going to look at. What we see is that in February of 1943, again, remember, all clock production has pretty much ceased as of middle of 1942. So we've been 6 months without alarm clocks, and it's starting to show. Consumers are saying, we need a clock so we can get up. You know, it may not seem like the most important thing, but if I can't get up and go to work, the whole war effort fails. So here we have, acting in the first part of 43, the WPB allows completion of work in process, that is, pieces and parts that were being manufactured in July of 1942. We know everybody couldn't just completely, very cleanly wrap up all the clocks they had. That obviously there were movements around, cases, parts in production, and so forth. So the WPB says, let's finish these up. We need alarm clocks badly. We can get these on the line right away. Let's finish these up in the first quarter of 1943 here. They also authorized the production of a new victory or conservation model clock starting in April of 1943 in the second quarter here. These clocks, conservation models, were to use only 10 pounds of brass per 1,000 clocks. West Clocks estimated they used probably about 300 pounds of brass per 1,000 clocks before the war. Another conservation step was a case made of molded wood fiber or paper mache in order to conserve metal. Other things they did, they wanted to ensure an equitable distribution of clocks to the war workers, to the consumers. And by that I mean we have a lot of new areas opening up. Seattle comes to mind with the Boeing factory just booming there in a town that wasn't all that big before. All the clocks produced could have been consumed in New York, Chicago, and all the big cities. But here we have war workers all throughout the country in new areas and so forth. And they wanted to make sure these clocks got out equitably among the workers and to all the industries and so forth. They also wanted to ensure, I'm not so sure that the WPB cared, but the manufacturers cared that there was an equitable distribution of the profits among the manufacturers. It became very clear that only one or two companies would be allowed to make clocks. And so the others quickly said, well, they're out here reaping the profits from making clocks. And those profits not only are money, but they're also reputation, the ability to keep your name in front of the public, over the war years. And I'm not being allowed to make clocks. Somehow this doesn't seem fair. So what happened is the WPB said, well, we just won't use a manufacturer's name on these clocks unless we have the war alarm. And as I say, there are no manufacturer's names on these clocks. In order to distribute the clocks fairly, what they did was gave the companies that were producing alarm clocks before the war, there were about 6 companies, and they said, we're going to assign each of you a quota of these clocks that have been made as if you had made them. And you will send them through your distribution channels, and you will get the profits from those clocks. So although West Clocks produced the clocks, they only sold a small fraction of the clocks that they produced. And all these clocks then were pooled and shared distribution. And again, that will play into our timeline as we look further down the road. Also then in April of 1943, the OPA set a maximum price of $1.65 for the spring-wound alarm clocks. We find then, reported in May of 43, all of a sudden electric clocks appear in the mix. Everything I've read up to this time, all the articles had referred to this conservation, this spring-wound model clock. The electrics appear out of nowhere, more or less. They are given a price of $4.95. And I think what probably has happened is in the meantime, General Electric has said, well, look, we can produce clocks, right away. We have plenty of capacity that's not being used for war work. And the need was such that they began to authorize also the production of the electric clocks. But they were sort of a second thought there. Definitely not a conservation model. They are the exact models that were produced before the war, used the same amount of materials and so forth. What we also find is that West Clocks and Gilbert, who ended up producing these conservation models, were already complaining that the movements that they we're being forced to make were not going to work very well. And we'll look at that here again in a minute. So we're going into production here of a clock that the companies are not very favorable of, but you know, we need to have alarm clocks, so the WPB says, well, we're going to produce these clocks. And again, very importantly, it said, but it cannot interfere with war production work. So again, only one or two companies were allowed to produce. Here we have a couple of articles announcing the beginning of production. These are taken from the TikTok, again, the West Clocks magazine. February of 43, they are announcing that the WPB has authorized production of these war clocks. And then in April, they said, you know, here we are, we're actually, you know, beginning to produce this clock. And we will see by May that the May issue of TikTok actually shows the clock, and we will show that beside the actual clock here in just a bit. Okay, I've identified 5 companies so far that have made these clocks. They are the Gilbert Clock Company of Winstead, Connecticut, Hammond Clock Company of Chicago, Illinois, the Telecron/GE of Ashland, Massachusetts, West Clocks Division of General Time, LaSalle, Illinois, and also United Clock Company of Brooklyn, New York. These are the ones that I have identified. It is possible there could be others. I have not seen them in a couple of years of looking. No other reference anywhere to any other factories that made these. But it's always something to be on the lookout for. But again, the telltale sign, as the dial says, war alarm. You notice here, too, that it was spelled 2 different ways. LaSalle, that's West Clocks, spelled it as 1 word. And Gilbert and Winstead there spelled it as 2 words. No great significance to that, other than maybe they're just trying to be different from each other. Okay, well, what were the first war alarms? Again, we go back to the timeline. The Jeweler Circuit of Keystone, which is a trade publication of the jewelry industry, reported in 1943 that the WPB was allowing work in process to be completed beginning in February. We also know that the OPA did not set the retail price until April. What I have observed is that some alarms some of the war alarms do not have an OPA price. I believe these clocks that were produced that do not have this OPA price marking indeed represent the work in process that was completed. What is apparent is that these are clocks that were in production by these companies in 1942 as they quit, and they have no OPA price on them. And as such, the OPA called for the price to be stamped on the back. It is not on these clocks, so they could not have been sold. So I think as such, all of these work in process clocks went to the military. And here we have first, which is the West Clocks Baby Ben model. Again, a model they've been making for a number of years. A metal case, mechanical movement, has no OPA price on it. This movement is definitely not a conservation movement. It's the same exact clock that they had made, you know, going into the war. Here we have 2 pair, actually. Notice a little bit different between the 2. I speculate, too, from this very short sample that the white clocks, as we see, are in pretty good condition. Probably went to the officers, and the green ones went to the grunts out in the field. You see they're a little bit more beat up. Also, this green paint, again, gives me the idea that they probably were military. The next one is from Hammond Clock Company. Hammond of Chicago, as far as we know, did not re-enter clock production after the war. We definitely know this model here was in production before the war. It's called the Fantasy model. You look over on the right, down at the bottom, you see the nameplate from Hammond. It says fantasy. It gives all the electrical information and so forth. If we look in the upper one, the upper war alarm clock does not have this metal plate. It just simply has the electrical information stamped on the bottom. But tellingly, it has two holes in the case where the metal tag could be attached. So again, I think these came down the line. They had not been finished before the war. They weren't going to be allowed to put their name on them, so they don't have this metal tag. They had to run off a batch of dials that said war alarm. But due to the nature of these Hammond clocks, and the telecrons even, they are a unit unto themselves, the dial, the movement, so forth, and they can be plugged into any number of cases. My question is were there other Hammond clock cases that these clocks were put into, that this size movement was put into? It is a possibility that there could be some other Hammond models out there. Again, they could not bear the metal tag. They would have to have a war alarm dial and no identification of Hammond on there. This is the only Hammond I've seen, not just the only model of Hammond, but the only Hammond war alarm I have seen. This one pictured here. And then, of course, we have the pre-war model at the bottom. So these two models, I believe, were produced from work in process. So they would have been produced in February, March of 1943. Now we come to the second quarter of 43, and the true victory model, or the conservation model clock. It had a wood fiber case, the paper mache case, had a steel movement. The brass plates were replaced by steel, and as I say, the clock companies went into producing this already claiming it's not going to work, but they did produce it. The OPA price needed to be stamped on the back of the clock, and we do have a figure from somewhat later production figures that show that there were about 1.7 million clocks produced in the second quarter of 1943. That would coincide with these victory model clocks. I suspect that the manufacturers quit producing this as soon as they could. What we do find is as the OPA set the price of the victory model in April of 43, at the same time the WTB was loosening up the materials needed to produce clocks, telling the factories that yes, you're going to be able to produce the brass movement again and so forth. So I suspect then that in the third quarter of 43 we did see the later model clocks, and that these companies would quit producing this victory model as quickly as possible. I think this 1.7 million figure is, pretty close to the total production, somewhere under 2 million clocks of this first model, the conservation model. Now, production started in 1943, but planning was well underway before that. Here we have a patent filed in 1941 by the Gilbert Clock Company for a pressed wood fiber case. Now, it's a question of, the dog leading the tail or the tail leading the dog. Did they produce this to, because the military needed, a case that needed less material? No, I don't think so. I think it's kind of the other way around, that Gilbert was fooling around with this clock when they were told that they may have to stop production of clocks because of metal shortages. They brought out this patent, showed it to the WTB, the War Production Board, and thus began to grow the idea of this conservation model. Here, this quotation is from the patent description. The case is especially intended for movements such as are usually employed in inexpensive alarm clocks. And they're characterized by comparatively loud ticking, which is often found objectionable in the stillness of the night. In addition to, very grabbing English there, we have them telling us that, they're developing this clock to make a soundproof case, as they call it, the ticking of a metal alarm clock. Picked up that balance wheel ticking back and forth and reverberated it, and people found the ticking objectionable. So Gilbert was working on this idea of this wood fiber case, I think, before the war, not because of material shortage, but because of other concerns. But it became important when they were told, well, you're not going to be producing clocks. And they said, well, maybe we can. Here's one way to do it. I think so out of that idea grew these clocks. But in addition, they said, well, let's look at the movement. Let's use less brass. So here we see the Gilbert wood fiber cases, mechanical clocks. We see the steel movement over here on the left. And as you'll see, there's hardly any brass in that movement. I see just 2 or 3 places where a little brass is sticking out. On the right, we see 2 models of Gilbert wood fiber cases. The one on the right most closely resembles the patent drawings. The one on the left is another model that Gilbert produced. They both have these steel movements. But, another question we could pose is, nothing's clean and tidy. They didn't produce exactly 1.7 million cases and 1.7 million movements. Are there wood fiber cases with brass movements? It certainly is, I think, a possibility. Also, the other way around, once we start to see the metal case come, it's possible that we could see it with the steel movement, although I think, less likely. The only other observation I'd make here on this slide is that it's really a treat to see these things with the original boxes that they came into. It calls to mind the Tompion exhibit that was here in Columbia last year. Had its original 300-year-old shipping box with one of the clocks. So we still got a ways to go on these boxes, but I still think it's wonderful to have those. Here's just a close-up look at the 2 Gilbert models. This is the simpler of the 2. We see here the OPA $1.65 excluding tax stamp or price stamp. You can see it on the position on the back of the clock. I do find it interesting, the 2 Gilbert models. This one has a square back, whereas the other Gilbert model has a round back. You would think the one with the square back was probably easier to produce. May have been the second model produced. This one also more closely matches the patent drawing. Again, maybe making me think it was the first one they produced, but don't really have any concrete proof of what order these were produced in. But here we see a sticker as opposed to having the price stamped into the back. So we have 2 models of Gilbert paper mache or wood fiber cases. In one of these boxes here we have the original paperwork. I think this is, again, just wonderful stuff to have. Notice that Gilbert is not mentioned. It just simply says War Alarm, Winstead, Connecticut, even as we get over to guarantee. It says send it back along with a porter to War Alarm, Winstead, Connecticut. Nowhere does it say Gilbert. Then we move on to the Westclox wood fiber case. Again, here it is with its box. And here is the cut from TikTok in May of '43 announcing, here's our clock that we're producing. Very proud of themselves to have gotten this clock into production in such short order. And again, I think it is a tribute to, what all of industry did in the war years. I don't know that, a company could react that quick today or could or would to get this whole new model. Again, Westclox was not involved in this fiber case. The WPB, I assume, came in and told Gilbert, said, your patent is great, in this case, so we want you to go share it with Westclox, and we want you to show them how to make these clocks. And indeed, that's what happened. But I think we find that again, as the price was set on these clocks, they're already loosening up materials to meet the needs of these clock companies who've already said this steel movement is not, the best of ideas. And I think, really what's happening here is already the War Production Board is seeing that American industry is just phenomenally productive. They couldn't have guessed how productive industry was going to be during the war years here. So we constantly are seeing a loosening up of the restrictions on materials and so forth as we go along in the war. Here's the back of the West clocks. Here's the steel movement. It is indeed a different movement from the Gilbert. They didn't share movements. West clocks, it's quite possibly they got on the ball and designed this movement, in just a couple of weeks or whatever, and got this into production. We do see there's a little bit more brass in this one. The gears are brass, or at least some of them are. So all in all, these are the wood fiber or the paper mache cases, the conservation model. We have 2 from Gilbert and the 1 from West clocks. Then we move on to the later model clocks. These clocks feature metal cases with brass movements, the mechanical clocks. We also see you coming in the electric alarms. These have plastic cases and wood cases. Again, I believe these clocks were probably produced starting the middle of 1943. In no particular order, we'll start with West clocks. We would notice if we put these side by side that this movement is exactly the same as the steel movement we saw a minute ago, except that now we have the brass plates. The other interesting observation I found is this one has a bell, whereas the earlier one just had a little piece of metal that the hammer banged on, sort of made a clapping or a buzzing noise. This one has a bell, nice metal case. I will guarantee you this one gets you up. If I were to set it off here, I don't think we would even need the alarm, the internet connection for it to get you up. It's a guaranteed to be a getter-upper. Here we have a picture of it with its box and again the paperwork that came with the West clocks. And here it is. Like this production, the war alarm is limited and intended expressly for essential workers in the war effort whose duties require being on the job on time. And again, the guarantee, send a war alarm, LaSalle, Illinois. No mention of West clocks on here. I found these war alarms in 4 different colors. I suspect, it started out with a black one. Seen more of the black ones for sure. But again, I think a lessening of restrictions as time went on. I suspect these clocks were produced from mid-43 through the end of the war alarm era, which I contend will try to show that ended in November of 44. But they continued to make this model for a while. How long, I don't know. Another little interesting thing I observed with these clocks, the white one bears a patent number stamped into the back, which the earlier black one does not. So again, just some changes in what was allowed, by the War Production Board and so forth over time of this year and a half or so. Again, I mentioned that, it was made, I think, after the war alarm era, if you will. Again, November of 44, I think, is the end. Obviously, there would be some parts left over and so forth. At this point, they were allowed to put manufacturer was allowed to put their name back on the clock. So we see the West clocks, same exact model. We see the OPA price on the back of $1.65. This tells us that it had to be sometime before 1947 when the OPA went out of business. And we also see over here right in the middle of the back there, it says Raven, which was the model name that they gave it after the war, as opposed to the war alarm model. Now it's the Raven. I don't know how long they continue to produce this clock. Would be interested on anything that any observations that you have on any of these clocks and so forth. If you want to contact me, certainly Katie can facilitate that, so forth. I'd love to continue my research and incorporate anything that any of you can add to it. Okay, and that is the Gilbert or the Westclox metal cased war alarm. Now we move to the Gilbert. Very similar looking clock. If we had them side by side, we'd see the base is a little bit different, simply about the same in size. Here again, we see that they've moved to a brass movement. This movement does not appear to be the same as the steel Gilbert movement from the conservation model, whereas Westclox just continued to make the same movement, just added the brass plates. I think Gilbert may have fallen back to a previous movement they used. Hard to say exactly. Excuse me. And here is the Gilbert in this post-war or post-restriction period. They're calling their clock the ruler. Again, fortunate to have a wonderful example with the box of paper. But we see over here on the left-hand side, again, the $1.65 OPA price. So, you know, this clock very closely related to the war alarm. Now we move on to the electrics. So we had two metal-cased later war alarms, the Westclox and the Gilbert. The Gilbert I've only seen in the black as a war alarm. You know, certainly the possibility exists that it's out there in a different color. Here is the Telechron war alarm number 1, model number 1 war alarm, plastic case. This clock was produced before the war, but I have not seen any with the war alarm dial that does not have the OPA price. As we saw, the Hammond, you know, did not. All the Telecrons I've seen do bear the OPA price. Again, the possibility is out there, but I have a feeling that GE did not participate in that work in process phase, that they began to produce these sometimes toward the middle of 43. This is the Model 1. Again, we can see the OPA price on the back. Here it is in the post-war, post-restriction period. It's got the Telechron name on the front. You notice it's got the model number now. Their Model 7H125. They called it the Dispatcher. I like the way some of these names, you know, are sort of militaristic, you know, reference back to the war period. The Dispatcher, the Ruler. I think we're going to find the Commander a little later on. Very interesting. But again, this one bears the OPA sticker on the back. There were two models, Telechron. This is the number 2, model number 2 war alarm. Again, bearing the OPA sticker on the back, war alarm on the front. This model continued on as the Chantilly, model 7H118. As such, I have seen it in the brown here. This has the OPA sticker. I have not seen a brown war alarm. Again, if it were a war alarm, instead of having the model number up the top there, it would have the war alarm number 2 on it. I have not seen those in brown. Again, there's a possibility out there. What I have seen is, here we see the Chantilly with the cream color. All the war alarms of this nature I've seen have this cream color, but I have also seen a grayish case, kind of a gray marble swirled clock that is a war alarm. So there was some variation in the casing of these telecrons, but again, I have not seen the brown, so keep your eye open for that one. And we come to the last one. We have the United, and it says our post-war command alarm. You'll notice I didn't show you the United war alarm. And that is very bad of me, because what happened is several years ago, I had one. But this was before my interest in the whole subject. It didn't fit in with what I was collecting at the time. This is probably 3 or 4 years ago, and I sold that clock. I've searched every old computer and device I have. I cannot find a picture, but it was a war alarm, looked just like this model here. I believe the feet were painted white. But this is kind of a distinguishing feature of a lot of these war alarms too, is that we have these painted steel bezels as opposed to brass plated or solid brass bezels. But this United, I believe, fits in probably to the very last period. We see in 1944 that the War Production Board begins to authorize what they call spot production. And I think that means that if you were a factory, you could say, well, I seem to have some extra capacity. Can I make such and such? Now, it's possible that, at that period they were already letting the factories put their names on these too. So I don't know about, exactly when this United was produced, but I would suspect it has not been produced nearly as long as the Telecron, simply because of the numbers. I see plenty of Telecrons out there, but have not been able to find this United again. But indeed, it does exist, and this is the 5th manufacturer. Another very interesting thing we look at here on this, we notice the OPA price, but it's increased to $6.60. So sometime from the end of 45 to the beginning of 47, the OPA has come in and allowed a price increase on these clocks. I have not seen this higher price on any others. I have seen a couple of other clocks. You've got one, I believe it's Sheldon Manufacturing, has an OPA price on it. It has the $4.95 price on it. But it does have the manufacturer's name and so forth. It's not a war alarm, but it must have been made in that 1946 era. So we'll wrap up here by taking a look at the timeline of production. Again, in 1943 in February, complete the work in process. This went on probably for a couple of months. In April, we see the launch of the Victory model, the papier-mâché case. Again, at that very same time, they say, well, we're loosening up, more material. So I think by July, we see the beginning of production of the later models, the metal cases, and so forth. This lasted until sometime in 1944. What we see in 1944 is that in a move to move back towards market conditions, the War Production Board authorizes a spot production of civilian goods. It's possible that at that time they let the companies put their name on them, but we do see that in November of 44, a discontinuation of the pool distribution plan we talked about earlier, the sharing of the profits and so forth. And we also see Telecron announces that we've returned to the market. There's Telecron clocks for sale now. The ad shows Telecron clock with the Telecron name and so forth on it. So that kind of wraps up my presentation here. Hopefully we can get Katie and I back together here if you have any questions. I hope you've enjoyed it. I thank you for your participation. And let's just see where we go from here. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Al, again. That was very interesting. So we'll open up the line now to any questions. If you do have a question for Al, just type it into the question box on your screen, and we'll try to answer those for you. And while we're waiting for any questions to be written, just wanted to remind everyone that get ready to sign up for our next webinar, which will be next month, February 15th. It will be a Sunday evening again at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And that's going to be given by Russ Oshel, and he's going to be presenting the remarkable clocks of Andrew V. Strait of Sydney, New York. And that information, the sign-up will be available on our website, and you'll also be getting an email notice about that too, but just mark that on your calendar if you're interested in learning about that topic too. I'd also like to thank the program committee and Pat Holloway for spearheading this webinar series and getting speakers lined up. And if you have suggestions or if you'd like to present something as a webinar, we would certainly like to hear from you. So either please contact Pat Holloway with the program committee or myself, and our information can be found on the NAWCC website. And we'd be most interested in any topics or speakers that you might suggest. And Al, I don't think we're getting any questions. We'll give everybody another minute.
Okay.
But I think you might have just blown everybody away.
Okay. Well, I'm glad we got the volume fixed there, and we can do
Yeah.
that. And yeah, I'd like to join with you in saying that you know, this is a great way to present material. I was telling Katie the other day, it's much easier for me to do this than to write an article, and I suspect a lot of other people are like that also. And I just urge any of you listening to, you know, put together one of your favorite subjects, and we'd like to hear from you. So thanks again so much for listening in.
Okay, I do have a couple questions now coming in. All right, first question from Mike Korn. Will you be emailing the link to the presentation to the group? And yes, Mike, that'll go out in an email tomorrow to you, and it'll have the link for the recording. It'll also be on our website under the education section. You can find the recording for this webinar and any of the past webinars that we've done. You can always go back and view those. And if you don't want to view them online, we do have copies available through the library that you can check out just like a DVD. Okay, Greg Smith says, I'm going to take my war alarm for show and tell. That's his next attribute.
Great, great.
Randall Lawrence asked, how accurate were the war alarm clocks pre-war versus war period?
You know, that's difficult to assess. I'll be quite honest with you. I know I think a lot of people expected a little more technical detail from me, but these clocks, you know, I grew up, we wouldn't even look at these clocks, you know, when they came into the store. You just can't economically work on alarm clocks. Today with collectors, you know, it may be somewhat feasible, but I've never had a lot of experience with these things. I suspect that the steel model, if it ran, it probably ran just as well as the others, any pre-war model. I don't think it's a question of timekeeping. I think the steel model is simply, you know, did not run too well. But I don't think it's a question of timekeeping so much.
Okay, and another question from Joel. How common were the cardboard or paper mache cases?
Okay, again, I had this figure that there were 1.7 million clocks produced in that second quarter of 43. I do believe, again, that that's most all of the cardboard ones, the paper mache, you know, under 2 million. Normal production in 1940-41 was about 12 million clocks, 12 million alarm clocks. So, this is only about a tenth of 1 year's production. The other later clocks, I think, from what I'm seeing, figures range from maybe 3 to 5 million of the later war alarms. So definitely the papier-mâché were the scarcest of the models. But again, within those later ones, I think United and the Hammonds were fairly scarce, and then also the Beatty-Benn model, the work-in-process model, I don't see it a lot. But it's surprising that there are a number of these paper models out there, and even more surprising to me was to see those in the condition, with the boxes, the paperwork, and so forth. So they are out there. You just got to keep your eyes open.
And one more question we have out says, this one is from Pat. I was surprised to see electric alarm clocks, as it seems there might have been some concerns about electric outages during this period. Do they appear to have been any concerns about the reliability of electric clocks?
No, I think by the 40s, certainly the clocks were reliable, and also, the electric grid, I think, was much more reliable than it had been in the 20s and 30s. I think also another impetus towards the electric clocks was simply, GE had the capacity to produce them, and clocks were needed. So, even if there might have been concerns about outages and so forth, it still got clocks on the market, and it got, 8, 9 days out of 10, or, better than that. So, I don't think that was a concern.
Okay, and that's all the questions that came in. So I'd like to thank you again, Al, for that great presentation, and thank everyone for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you all back here next month. Thank you.